On a frozen hill in the quiet town of Martha Ridge, an old farmer woke to find tiny paw prints crossing his yard in the dead of night. He didn't know then that those tracks would lead to one of the most touching stories he'd ever live. A tale of a starving mother bobcat who defied her own wild nature to keep her kittens alive through the cruelest winter of her life. The wind had been howling across Martha Ridge all night, scraping against the windows of Harold Barnes's farmhouse, like an old violin bow on rusted strings. It was the kind of winter night that made even the coyotes silent. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, a sound cut through the wind, a sharp trembling cry. Half animal, half child. Harold woke instantly. After 70 winters in Colorado, he'd learned to recognize every sound the land could make. But this one was different. He reached for the flashlight by his nightstand, slipped into his coat, and opened the door. The cold hit him like a hammer, biting through the wool and into his bones. Snow swirled under the yellow beam of his light. His old dog, Duke, barked once from inside. Uneasy, Harold whispered, "Easy, boy. I won't be long." He stepped off the porch, boots crunching on the ice. The moon hid behind clouds, but he could still see the faint outline of the barn and the coop beyond. Then movement. A shadow darted by the trash bins near the fence. The cry came again, softer, this time almost desperate. Harold's hand tightened on the flashlight as he approached. There, under the wooden rail, was a bobcat, thin as wire, ribs showing through its fur. It froze when the light hit. Its yellow eyes met Harold's, wild, terrified, but not hateful. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Harold could hear only the wind and the quick, ragged breathing of the animal. Then the bobcat lowered its head, sniffed through the trash, and picked up something small. A piece of frozen chicken skin. It didn't run. It simply looked back at him, as if begging permission. Then, limping slightly, it slipped through the fence and vanished into the darkness, toward the forest. Harold stood there for a while, his breath turning to mist. The snow began to fall again, covering the paw prints almost as fast as they were made. He felt a strange ache in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. He told himself it was nothing, just another hungry stray, drawn by the scent of food. Still, when he turned back toward the house, he found his eyes drifting to the woods, searching for one last sign of movement. Inside, the fire in the stove had nearly died. He tossed in a few logs and watched the flames crawl upward. The old wall clock ticked steadily, filling the silence. Duke came to rest his head on Harold's knee, sensing the unease. Harold stroked the dog's ears absently. "Just another night," he murmured. That's all it was. But he couldn't shake the feeling that those eyes, those desperate, pleading eyes, had seen him, not as a threat but as a chance. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stared through the frosted window. Outside, the snow thickened into a white curtain. In that stillness, he heard echoes from another time, his wife's laughter as she tossed corn to the birds. Her voice sang, "Everything alive deserves a chance, Harold." He hadn't thought of her voice in years. Not since the day she was buried on the hill behind the barn. The bobcat's cry had pulled that memory out of him like a thread. When morning came, the world was blanketed in white. Harold bundled up and stepped outside again just to make sure his animals were safe. Chickens clucked quietly, unharmed. But near the coop, something caught his eye. A faint line of small paw prints, leading toward the woods. The snow had stopped, leaving each print sharp and perfect, as if the forest itself had signed its name. Harold followed a few steps, then stopped. He noticed a small spot of brown melted into the snow. Not blood. Exactly. But something dark, warm once, now frozen. He crouched down, ran his glove over it, and looked up at the
Trian.
"She's hurt," he whispered. He didn't know why he said she, but somehow he was she. That evening, as the sun bled out behind the mountains, Harold sat by the window, watching the treetops sway. He should have called animal control, or at least told Ted across the road. Ted always had a rifle ready for predators, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Something about the look in that creature's eyes made the idea feel
Wrong.
He made a mental note to set out the compost bin earlier, maybe leave a few scraps near the fence just in case. She came back. By midnight, the storm
Had passed.
The sky was clear, the stars so bright they looked close enough to touch. Harold couldn't sleep.
He went
Out once more, the flashlight trembling slightly in his aging hand. The snow crunched, the air sharp in his lungs. Near the trash bins, he found what he half expected, more prints, and beside them something small and round, a piece of eggshell, cracked but clean. He bent down, staring at it under the
beam.
A bobcat stealing eggs.
That
Didn't make sense. They hunted rabbits, not breakfast. Yet here was proof, delicate as a secret. He turned back toward the house, his breath visible in the cold air. As he reached the porch, Duke began to growl low in his throat, staring toward the woods. Harold followed the dog's gaze, but saw only the line of pines swaying gently in the wind. Then he heard it again, the same cry, distant now, fading into the trees. He whispered into the night, "Whatever you're fighting for, I hope it's worth it." The wind answered with silence. Inside, Harold sat by the fire. Once more, the warmth creeping back into his hands. He thought of how fragile life could be out here, how a few scraps of food could mean survival.
He
remembered the hard winters after the recession when neighbors lost their homes, their farms, their hope.
He'd
seen good men crumble because they couldn't feed their families. Maybe that's why the cry had hit him so deep. Hunger had a sound, and it didn't belong to just one species. Before he went to bed, Harold looked out the window one last time. Far at the edge of the forest, he thought he saw a faint glimmer, two yellow eyes watching him, steady and unafraid. For a moment it felt almost like recognition. He smiled, a tired, gentle
smile.
"Sleep well out there, little one." Then he turned off the lamp. Outside, the snow fell in silence, erasing all tracks except the ones that had already been written into his heart. Morning crept slowly across Martha Ridge, painting the snow in pale gold. Harold Barnes stood on his porch, coffee steaming in his hand, watching his breath rise and fade into the cold air. The storm had finally passed, leaving a silence so deep he could hear the wooden beams of the porch crack in the chill. Somewhere beyond the barn, Duke barked once and then fell quiet again. Harold's farm stretched across 10 acres of rough Colorado soil. It wasn't much, just a few chickens, 2 goats, and the old barn that had seen better days.
He'd
been living alone since Martha passed 8 years ago. The world had gotten smaller.
Since then,
He didn't mind the quiet.
he
Told himself that often, but sometimes the stillness felt too heavy, like a blanket he couldn't throw off.
He went
about his chores methodically.
He
refilled the chicken feeders, shoveled the snow from the path, and checked the pipes to make sure nothing had frozen. Overnight, every movement was slow but sure, a man who knew how to live with the land even when the land was cruel. At breakfast, he ate toast and eggs. Funny, he thought, given what that Bobcat had taken last night. The image of her gaunt body and sharp, haunted eyes wouldn't leave his mind. He didn't understand why it bothered him so much. Wild animals came and went around the ridge all the time, but this one had looked different. A car engine rumbled in the distance, breaking the morning calm. Harold peered through the frosted window and saw an old Ford truck pull into his
driveway.
It was Ted Walker, his neighbor from across the hill. Ted was everything Harold wasn't. Talkative, practical, always wearing that same brown jacket and cap with the farm and feed supply logo. His wife Nora sat beside him, knitting something even as the truck rolled to a stop. Ted climbed out, slamming the door. "Morning, Harold. You got a minute?" Harold opened the door, nodding.
"Come on.
"In before you freeze to death." Inside, Ted stomped the snow off his boots and went straight to the stove, rubbing his hands. "Heard some ruckus last night. You all right out here?"
"Fine," Harold said.
"Just a storm." The wind was throwing everything around. Ted's expression tightened. "Not just the wind. Word is someone's been losing chickens down the road. Hank lost for last week, and Nora swears she saw tracks behind our coop yesterday. Big ones, cat-like." Nora looked up, knitting needles still moving. "I told him it could be a bobcat. They come closer when the snow's heavy. They get desperate." Harold poured coffee for everyone. Desperate's the word for
it.
Ted sipped and frowned. "You seen anything?" Harold hesitated. He could have lied, but he didn't. "Maybe there was one by the trash bin last night. Skinny thing. Didn't cause trouble. Just looking for scraps." Ted's eyebrows shot
up.
"You let it walk. Didn't seem right to shoot it," Harold said quietly. "Didn't even act wild. Looked more scared than dangerous." Ted set his cup down a little too hard. "Harold, that's how it starts. They come for scraps, then they come for livestock. You can't go soft on predators. They don't know the difference between kindness and weakness." Harold met his eyes. "Maybe people don't either." Nora's hands paused a minute, and for a second no one spoke. Then Ted sighed, pulling his gloves back on. "I'm just saying, watch your coop. You know, animal control doesn't come cheap. Better to stop trouble before it starts." After they left, Harold stood by the window, watching their truck disappear into the road that wound between the snowy pines. His reflection in the glass looked older than he remembered. Maybe Ted was right. Maybe he was getting
soft.
But he couldn't forget how the Bobcat had limped away, clutching that bit of food like it was her last hope. He spent the afternoon repairing the fence, humming old country tunes under
his breath.
The rhythm of work calmed him. He stacked hay, checked the feed bins, and reset the solar lights along the driveway. Small things that reminded him of purpose. Out here, even loneliness had its chores. As the sun began to drop behind the ridge, Harold decided to check his security camera by the chicken coop. It was an old model he'd bought years ago, the kind advertised in home security brochures, with slogans about peace of mind in every season. He scrolled through the night footage, expecting nothing but snowflakes and shadows. Then he saw it. At 24 a.m., a faint blur crept into frame. The same Bobcat. She moved cautiously, her body trembling, breath visible in the cold. She paused near the coop door, sniffed the air, then in one smooth motion, reached her paw through a gap in the
wood.
A moment later, she emerged with something small in her mouth, a single
egg.
Harold leaned closer, his heart slowing. The animal didn't eat it. Instead, she carried it gently, vanishing into the trees. He sat back, speechless. He'd lived through droughts, fires, even the recession when he almost lost the farm. But he'd never seen anything like that. A predator risking everything for an egg. That night, As he sat by the fire, he found himself thinking about the way she had moved, cautious, trembling, but determined. It reminded him of something deeper, something he hadn't felt since the days he and Martha struggled to keep the farm alive, the will to protect what little you have left. He turned on the old radio, letting a slow country song fill the room. Outside, the wind had died. The stars looked close enough to touch.
Duke
Snored softly near the hearth. Harold whispered, "If she's still out there, she'll be back." He didn't know if he was warning himself or hoping for
it.
Later that night, he stepped outside. Once more, flashlight in hand. The snow glowed under the moonlight. Near the fence, a fresh set of paw prints led away toward the forest, small, neat, and purposeful. He felt something stir. Inside him, a strange sense of connection that both comforted and frightened him. He followed the prints a few yards, then stopped. Beyond the fence, the woods stretched out like a dark ocean. Somewhere in there, a mother was fighting to feed her young. Harold had spent his life fixing broken fences and patching roofs, but now he faced something no hammer could mend. The quiet ache of empathy. He turned back toward the porch, the light from the house flickering warm through the snow. Maybe Ted would call it foolish, but Harold didn't care.
He'd
spent too many years guarding what was
his.
Maybe it was time to protect something that wasn't. He closed the door behind him, and for the first time in years, the house didn't feel quite as empty. The following morning dawned brittle and blue, the kind of winter light that made everything seem sharper. The cold, the silence, even memory. Harold Barnes sat at his small kitchen table, a mug of coffee cooling beside a half-eaten biscuit. The security camera footage from last night still looped in
his head.
That bobcat carrying an egg, careful as a mother carrying her child. It didn't make sense. Nature didn't act like that. But there it was on screen, as clear as
day.
He couldn't stop thinking about her. The way she moved, the limp in her front leg, the way she paused to look back toward his house before disappearing into the trees. Most folks would have shrugged it off, maybe called wildlife control, and been done with it. But not Harold, not after what he'd seen.
He pulled on his heavy
coat and went out into the cold.
Duke
trotted beside him, tail low, his paws crunching through the frost. Harold opened the chicken coop carefully. The hens clucked softly, unharmed. He counted the eggs, 7, not 8. One missing, the same as the night before. She took another, he muttered, though there was no anger in his voice. He glanced toward the woods, half expecting to see her yellow eyes watching from the shadows. As he worked, the familiar sound of tires on snow drew near. A small red SUV rolled up the path and stopped. Out stepped Lena Walker-Burr, Ted's niece, barely 22, and always full of energy. She worked part-time at the local animal rehabilitation center, and Harold liked her more than he'd admit. "Morning, Mr. Barnes," she called, her breath making small clouds in the air. Uncle Ted said, "You've got a bobcat problem." Harold smiled faintly. "That's what he calls it." She laughed, pulling her knit hat lower over her ears. "He's been talking about it nonstop. Figured I'd stop by before he builds a trap, or something. Mind if I look around?" "Suit yourself," Harold said, stepping aside. Lena moved quietly, scanning the ground. Near the coop. "You know," she said, kneeling to inspect the snow. "Most bobcats don't come this close to houses. Unless they're desperate. This one's got small tracks near her own. Must be kittens. She's feeding them." Harold's brows furrowed. "Kittens? Yeah. If she's taking eggs, she's not eating them herself. She's carrying them home." He said nothing, just watched her. She was young, but her voice carried that quiet confidence of someone who knew animals, someone who understood survival beyond textbooks. Lena stood up, brushing snow from her
Knees.
if she's injured or starving, animal control will just put her down. But if she's raising young, maybe we can help her bring food close to the woods, away from the chickens. Harold looked toward the pines, the place where he'd first seen the bobcat vanish. The idea of helping her felt strange, maybe foolish, but something in him wanted to do it. He nodded. I've got some leftover stew meat in the freezer. Not much, but it might keep her from risking another trip here. That's perfect, Lena said, smiling. Just keep it clean. No bones, no seasoning.
Wild.
Stomachs can't handle salt. As she turned to leave, Harold caught himself asking, You think she knows I'm not her enemy? Lena's smile softened. Maybe. Sometimes they know more about kindness than we do. After she drove off, Harold went to the shed, grabbed a small bucket of thawed meat, and walked down the narrow path.
Behind his barn,
The air smelled like pine and cold metal.
he stopped at the
Edge of the trees where the snow was untouched. Placing the food on a flat rock, he whispered, For your family, not mine. Duke whimpered softly beside him, uneasy. Harold gave the dog's head a pat. Don't worry, boy. She's not out to hurt us. By dusk, the snow began again. Harold sat inside, watching from the window. The wind howled, the world shrinking into whiteness. Then movement, just a flicker near the tree, and the bobcat emerged, cautious head low.
She sniffed.
The air limping toward the rock. Her ribs showed through her fur. She took a piece of meat, turned, and disappeared. Again. He watched, heart pounding. There was no doubt now she had babies out there. Later that night, he replayed the footage again. The timestamp showed her visit precisely at 8:46 p.m., the same moment the wind had rattled his shutters. She was predictable, almost disciplined.
He found comfort in that
rhythm. The next day, Ted stopped by, unannounced, face red from the cold and irritation. Harold, I just got a call from Hank. He found bobcat prints near his coop, too. You're feeding the thing, aren't you? Harold stiffened. She's not hurting anyone yet?
Ted
Snapped. You think kindness keeps a wild animal from killing? You're risking everyone's livestock for some bleeding heart nonsense. You want to feed her?
Go
Work at that animal shelter with Lena. The words hit harder than they should.
have.
Harold turned away, jaw tight. You worry about your own land, Ted. I'll worry about mine. After Ted left, Harold walked to the porch and sat in the cold. He thought about all the years he'd spent protecting this little piece of earth, patching fences, fixing barns, paying off farm insurance he'd barely used. For
What?
to keep out everything wild, everything that reminded him life wasn't meant to be controlled. That night, snow fell again, heavy and relentless. Harold set another small tray of meat near the woods and went back inside. Hours passed before he heard it.
The
faintest sound, almost like a whisper, against the glass. He turned and froze. The bobcat was there, right by the porch, her breath fogging the window.
in
Her mouth, something small glistened in the moonlight.
an egg. He stepped
Closer, eyes wide. She set it gently on the porch rail, stared at him for a heartbeat, and then vanished into the
trees.
For a long while, Harold stood there, unhulled to move. The egg sat where she'd placed it, unbroken, fragile as a secret. He whispered, You brought it back. The wind sighed through the pines as if answering him. By morning, the egg had frozen solid, but Harold didn't throw it away.
He
Placed it in a small wooden bowl on the windowsill next to Martha's picture.
The
sunlight touched both softly.
he
Understood now what unthinkable really meant. It wasn't an act of violence or instinct. It was something far rarer. A mother breaking the laws of nature for
love.
Harold brewed another pot of coffee and sat by the fire. Outside, the snow kept falling, erasing footprints again.
But
He knew they'd be back. Somewhere deep in the forest, a wild mother was doing what every creature, human or animal, would do when cornered by hunger and hope. Fight for her family. And for the first time in years, Harold felt alive. By the fourth morning, Harold Barnes
couldn't sit still.
He'd spent 3 nights watching the tree and waiting for the Bobcat's return. Each night, she came and went like smoke, silent, cautious, and purposeful. But something inside him had shifted.
He
No longer saw her as a threat.
he saw
Her as a mother trying to survive the kind of winter that took mercy from everything. The thought kept him awake. Long after the fire had burned low,
he
knew he shouldn't interfere with wild
Shinyet
animals. Every wildlife management guide
said the same.
Yet there he was at dawn, pulling on his boots and coat, filling a thermos of coffee, and tucking a bag of raw meat into his satchel. Duke followed. At his heel, ears twitching with anticipation. "Stay close," Harold murmured, patting the dog's head.
We're
"Just taking a look." No heroics. The sky was pale gray when they reached the woods. Frosted branches creaked overhead. Harold followed the faint trail of paw prints through the snow, each one smaller and lighter than the
last.
The forest smelled clean, cold, pine, and earth locked in ice.